My name is Marc Schwartz. I'm a professor of education at the University of Texas at Arlington. And I'm also the director of the Southwest Center for Mind, Brain, and Education. Often when I talk about mind-brain education, I use this graphic that we're looking at right here that shows the three disciplines in question, that of neuroscience, brain, that of the cognitive sciences, mind, and that of education. And what we often think about in the society of mind-brain education, as well as at the center, is how these three disciplines can collaborate in order to further the understanding of learning and teaching. One of the issues that comes out of learning about teaching, as well as learning about the learning process, is something that I've encountered many times over the many years that I've been teaching. And it's something I've come to call the illusion of understanding. Now, the illusion of understanding can be nicely illustrated with these three items that I have on the table. Now, this is a cup of water, but I'd like you to think about this as a swimming pool. And a smaller cup, and I'd like you to think about that as a canoe. And I'm going to put this canoe in just a moment in the swimming pool. But before I do that, I'm going to put this weight in the canoe, and I'm going to set up the problem for you to think about right now with this canoe with a weight in a swimming pool. What I'd like you to think about is the following. If I took the weight out of the canoe and put it into the swimming pool, what would happen to the level of water? Would it go up? Would it stay where it was when we started this problem, or would it go down? Now, it turns out that I've been asking this question for many years, and I've asked it of many different groups: science teachers, graduate students, students in classrooms. And what I find is that no matter what group I ask, there is never a clear consensus on the right answer. And even for people who have the right answer, often they're not sure why the answer is the answer. Now, I find this a very compelling problem, or a very compelling issue. Why is it that this feeling that the answer is something that you could be confident in? Because in most cases, I would say that people I talk to, if they have an answer, they're often fairly confident about it. So this illusion is something that most educators would like to, of course, displace and replace with something I'm going to call authentic understanding. And so the goal will be for educators to figure out, how do I establish authentic understanding? And of course, the cognitive sciences and neurosciences weigh in on some of these ideas. And I'll give you 5, and I'm going to call them 5 principles. The first principle is probably the most important, and that is all understanding, and here we're talking about authentic understanding, is grounded in experience. Without experience, most of what we understand becomes what I often call borrowed understanding. It lasts long enough so that you may be able to repeat it back. You may have experienced this as well. But the other important feature about grounded in experience is that it offers a foundation. So if you think about building a house, you would never think about it as a project where you wouldn't first start with a foundation. Some teachers will say that they don't have the time for that foundation, but I'm going to stress that if your objective is to build authentic understanding, or offer your students the opportunity to build authentic understanding, it begins with experience. Set that foundation. The second important aspect of authentic understanding is that understanding is hierarchically organized. That is, from least complex to most complex. And so as you look at this problem, you might think, oh, I've had experience with things where I put my hand in water and maybe I've noticed the water rise. That is, if you've done the dishes enough time. So our experiences are important, and the way they're organized comes out of our experience. But you may also be thinking, why did I use this problem if the solution was so easy? There is some complexity to this, and that takes time to develop. What I have found that happens when these two themes or these two principles are not adequately addressed in the classroom, we have what some teachers, science teachers primarily, would call misconceptions. Sometimes I've heard it described as naive conceptions or misunderstandings, but Here I would just like to emphasize that it's just understanding in process, developing this understanding over time into greater or more complex ideas, which relies on three more principles. One is the opportunity for students to see themselves as part of the solution, and that requires them being part of the feedback loop. Now, when teachers think about feedback, normally think about themselves being the principal individual giving the feedback. I would like you to think about feedback from the point of view of situations where you're not necessary. And so you might think about learning to drive. In that case, as you're learning to drive, you notice immediately that turning the wheel to the right turns the car to the right. Of course, the same is true turning it to the left. The car goes to the left. So as you're learning to drive, you can see that primarily the goal is to stay on the road. So turning the wheel is what's going to give you some indication of what the car is going to do, and as you look out into the road, you can see what's going to happen as you turn the wheel. What's not as useful is the person next to you saying, turn the wheel a little bit more to the right. No, 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 that's too much, a little bit less. No, actually now turn the wheel back to the left. I think most of us who've learned to drive recognize those are distractions. What we're aiming for are experiences where the student acts, and as a result of taking action, can see what happens in the world. We can think about this as the same opportunity. What would happen if you took the weight out of the canoe and put it into the water? You wouldn't need me necessarily to perform this experiment. The last two themes rely on something that's related. The first is context. Authentic understanding becomes more robust through additional context. And teachers will often say they don't have enough time for additional context, but here's an example of one that relates to this particular problem. As we look at this particular picture, you may notice that there's ice in the water, and some of the ice is above the level of the water, some of it's below it. But if I ask a similar question, what happens to the level of water when the ice melts? Does the level stay exactly where it was when we started the problem? Did it go up or did it go down? Sounds similar. It is basically a problem that has to do with buoyancy, and I haven't named it yet, but Archimedes' principle, but it's a different context. Developing authentic understanding relies on a number of different contexts and your ingenuity in developing them. The last theme or principle that's important in establishing authentic understanding can be best emphasized through this little joke of tourists, several tourists coming to New York City, and they stop at a corner where they notice a street musician playing, and they ask him, how do we get to Carnegie Hall? And the musician looks up and says, practice, practice, practice. Now, we discount practice for the same reasons that we discount the importance of multiple contexts and experience. Most of it is time. We don't have the time. But I'd like to remind you that without practice, there's little ability to stabilize the understanding. That you want to be able to demonstrate the understanding as the fourth principle would demand, context change. So authentic understanding depends on these five principles. It's grounded in experience. It's developed through a hierarchical process with increasing complexity. It relies much on formative feedback, which leaves the student empowered. It's more robust as we think of more contexts in which to offer problems. It's stabilized with ongoing practice. And so now you may be thinking, now's the time for the answer. Now, if I gave you the answer, I would be violating at least two of the principles of authentic understanding. I would be denying you the opportunity of having your own experience. And what I would be doing is violating the third on feedback. It wouldn't be your feedback. I would be essentially telling you or showing you the answer. So I encourage you, if you're interested in the answer, make it your own problem.